crack on, I think.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Who would have thought we would have teething troubles, technical teething troubles on the first of our Lifting the Lid meetings. So thanks for bearing with us. If you managed to make it across to this stream, perhaps we'll pick up a few more people as we go. And there's always a recording to catch up on later if you missed the beginning of this. But welcome, round two of welcoming. Hopefully you have some folks watching now. But it's good to have you with us wherever you're watching from, however you managed to hear about this and get connected. What we're doing this evening is starting the first of a series. It probably won't be every single week, but kind of series of useful, hopefully useful conversations with different folks, unpicking who knows what. Well, tonight we're going to be unpicking the idea of mental health, and particularly mental health in lockdown. How do we develop strong, resilient minds, especially at a time like this? And so we've got Phil Swan all the way from Llanelli coming to speak with us. So thanks, Phil, for joining us. Maybe before you introduce yourself and say hello, I can introduce our third little window. You might be able to see at the bottom of your screen. That is the information, all the information you need to get involved in the Q&A this evening. So first of all, we'll try and get to know Phil a little bit, see where he's coming from. And then I'll hand over to Phil and he'll give us a little presentation on mental health and developing resilience. And then we'll have a kind of last half an hour together. We'll try and finish about 8:30, but we'll have a good half an hour or so to answer questions in real time. So you can go to this website called Slido. You can either put in the address there, app.sli.do, or you could just Google Slido and you'll find it easy enough. You don't have to sign up to anything. All you have to do then is put in the meeting number, which is that number you can see, 10095. That'll take you to our meeting question page, and you can type in a question, and all the questions that get typed in, you can see them. So if you don't want to type in a question, but you want to kind of browse and see what other people are asking, you can still go on that and then vote for questions that you like. So you can thumbs up different questions and it'll bump the ones that are most popular to the top of the pile, and we'll know which ones most people have, and then we'll kind of answer those first. You can put your names to those questions or just leave them anonymous. That's up to you. So that's open the whole time we'll be talking. So feel free to get involved with that, type away. And then once Phil's kind of done with his presentation, we'll have a go at, well, I suppose Phil will have a go at answering questions and guarantees to give every single one satisfactory answer, I'm sure. But yeah, do get involved in that. It would be great, not just to have you listening in, but participating as well. So Phil, good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. I first heard this material from you at Swansea University a couple of months, well, 2 or 3 months ago, just before lockdown. We were there speaking with university students about all sorts of different subjects, different topics, and connecting them to the good news about Jesus. So I heard this, thought it would be really helpful to share it with folks from our church and anybody else who fancied listening in. So thank you for joining us this evening. Maybe it would be good just to get to know you first. I know maybe a few folks will recognize your face from various events and preaching at our church, well, a couple of years ago now. But anyway, Phil, who are you? Where do you come from? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Who am I? That's a question I ask myself all the time, if I'm really honest. I was born in Wales, brought up in southwest London. My parents emigrated there when I was just 4 weeks old. Grew up just outside place you probably heard of, like Staines, Twickenham, Richmond, that sort of area. My dad was a pastor. I was, compliant but not believing. Eventually left home, went to Cardiff to train as a physio. While I was there, when I was 20, I became a Christian. And then I started my career as a physiotherapist, and very, very rapidly fell into the area of psychiatry. So I worked in a psychiatric hospital for some time, and then eventually, which was Whitchurch Hospital, and then transferred to University Hospital Wales, where I was particularly involved in the physiotherapy department, looking at things like pain, which isn't necessarily of an organic origin. And we ran a stress management clinic, which has proven to be quite successful, really. Interestingly, my colleague was a Roman Catholic priest, or he had been. And he decided that he was leaving all of that. And in 1990, I started in the ministry. So we were like ships passing in the night. He was a fascinating man, the nearest to a genius I've ever met. And I started, though, in ministry in 1990 in West Yorkshire, in Pontefract. Was 5 years there, and I was in Bridgend for 3 years as an associate pastor, and I've been in Llanelli ever since as the pastor of Llanelli Free Evangelical Church. And I think probably it's fair to say that my interest in terms of the subject tonight was very much rooted in my career prior to going into the ministry. I've kind of kept up an interest in it. It's very much been at the back of my mind though for many years, but I'd say in the last 10 years, it's been much more at the front of my mind. So now pastorally, often the interface between mental health issues and spiritual issues is absolutely huge. And I've developed a particular interest in the area of trauma, and I think probably sadly male suicide as well. But I'm speaking as a pastor, not as a clinician. I think it's important to put that disclaimer in.
Yeah. Phil, brilliant. It's thank you. Yeah, just good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. I think it's great what you're doing with this, and the technology makes it relatively simple.
Yeah,
but it's a great opportunity to look at something like this. Thank you. Great.
Well, before you crack on and I recede into the background, it's probably worth saying that this isn't going to be our only conversation about this kind of thing. There are folks in our church who are really well qualified to kind of take on loose ends or things that come up from this conversation, to take them on into the future kind of much more personally. So if there's something this evening that makes you think, I really need to talk to somebody, I'm sure Phil would be more than willing to chat. You could get in contact with him, or if you're Ammanford based, kind of connected with Ammanford Evangelical Church, then there are folks in our church family who'd love to spend time with you or point you in the right direction. So don't let this be the only time we think about mental health. Not just this time, but in our lives. But thank you, Phil, for coming and introducing it to us, or maybe moving our thinking on a few steps. So I'm going to leave you to it, and don't forget those questions. So Slido 10095, send them in, and we'll have a go at tackling those later on. But thanks very much, Phil.
Okay, pleasure. And I would, underline what John has said there. I think there are some excellently capable people in Ammanford who'd be great to talk to. And quite frankly, I wish we're doing this presentation tonight. But here you are, you're stuck with me. And what I thought it'd be helpful is that if I've put what I want to do on some, if you like, some slides. And so I'm going to put those on the screen now. And right, here we are. So can you, hopefully, John, can you see those okay?
Yeah, I can see those.
Good. Okay. And I'm going to rattle through these quite quickly. I've got quite a few slides and I'm conscious of the time, but this is the subject we've been given for tonight, lockdown and mental health. You don't need me to tell you that our world is serious right now. There is a hidden silent danger among us, so much so that something simple 6 months ago, if you thought that going to the supermarket could be a life-threatening experience, you would have just laughed. But of course, the reality now is there is the potential for that. And tragically, here in the UK, we have a really quite horrendous death rate. In fairness, there may be other countries which are not recording the same way and the same honesty that we are. But if you do take these stats at face value, the indication is that 1 in 10 of global deaths are taking place in the UK. But what we both know tonight is that this really has turned what we would have regarded as normal life upside down. So much so that the phrase the new normal is now a regular part of our vocabulary. And there is, of course, huge uncertainty about the future. Now, all of that can be very, very challenging to us. It can be challenging to us in different ways. And we're going to explore some of those ways briefly. But of course, for our subject tonight, it can be very challenging to our mental health. And I do want to stress tonight that my emphasis is very much on mental health rather than mental illness. It's remaining healthy in the midst of the serious world in which we're living in. Well, life has suddenly changed. And it's changed in all sorts of ways, not least of which terrible haircuts, if you've had a go yourself. It's one of the things I'm really looking forward to. When the barbers open, I think I'm probably going to be first in the queue, and you may feel similarly. But life has changed. Work has changed. Probably many of you have been furloughed. You may even have lost your job. or your job may be under threat all of a sudden as a result of this virus. And the knock-on effect of that into things like our finances, our financial stability, can be absolutely huge. We know that there's been huge disruption in the area of school, which might have pleased your children initially, but as time's gone on, the probability is it's become a rather very real present burden to you as you're concerned for their ongoing education, and you suddenly find yourself looking at homeschooling, something that you never intended to do. And that can put big pressures on the family. There can be all sorts of tensions, suddenly having to spend lots of time together in lockdown can create huge internal pressures. And one of the really sad things that's happened and come out of the lockdown is the increased incidence, it seems certainly at least, of phone calls to agencies providing support for domestic abuse. Things that we took for granted in terms of our leisure, being able to go out for a coffee, a meal, browse a bookstore, do things with great freedom, drive 50 miles to a different part of Wales or something like that. We can't do it anymore. And not least of which, as you know, there have been huge changes and challenges for church. Now, it is a real challenge. I think it's very important when you look at anything to do with maintaining good mental health, that we're really honest about the context and the circumstances that we face. One of the biggest challenges is, of course, we are social creatures. We're designed for relationship. And so when we find that things like normally being able to go around your friend's house, see your grandchildren, or go and see your elderly parents or your best mate or whatever it is, suddenly these things are taken from us. And we respond in certain ways. So, for example, I think there are 3 key ways we responded. Effectively, we grieve. We grieve when important things that are important to us, are taken away from us. It elicits that kind of response within us. We may also find ourselves becoming anxious when there are big changes taking place, which we don't really understand. And perhaps worst of all, we feel we have no control over it. That can become very, very stressful. And then thirdly, of course, we fear when we basically can't see a way forwards in the future. Now, I want to stress that these are actually very normal human responses to life's challenges. There's nothing wrong with grieving. Actually, a measure of anxiety is perfectly appropriate, as indeed is a measure of fear in certain contexts. And one of the things we have to be careful of when we talk about mental health in lockdown is that perhaps many of the things we're feeling, we mustn't underestimate as being simply normal human responses to a highly abnormal situation. But these responses do affect us, and the classical ways in which they affect us, they affect our bodies. One of the things I was involved in very much as a physio was looking at the effects of thoughts and emotions on the body. And so classically, some of the ordinary things you may have felt initially, certainly tired for no reason at all. Although now we know there's such a thing as Zoom fatigue. Your sleep may have become disrupted. You just generally feel sluggish and heavy and achy. And one of the things that's interestingly emerging to do with the body in lockdown is that there's appearance anxiety. You're worried about how the fact you can't get that haircut or whatever. It's fascinating this afternoon to notice that some of the some of the clinics offering cosmetic surgery apparently having an upsurge of interest as people are becoming more aware of their appearance. Again, that may even have something to do with greater appearances on Zoom where you actually see yourself. The mind is clearly affected. We know that at this time it's likely that we'll feel more anxious. We may feel sad. We may enter into periods of despair. And as we've said, fear. But as well as this, we may become angry. Anger is often there with us as human beings, and often we don't recognize it honestly. And the way the mind functions as it seeks to adapt, maybe you're having to work from home now, and you are spending a lot longer online, or your children are. And so adapting to new modes of learning and working can develop all sorts of problems with concentration. And suspicion, there's loads we could put in the list, but I've put this one in very deliberately. I don't know if you're aware, but Rhondda Cynon Taf has one of the highest incidents of COVID, people testing positive for the COVID-19 virus. I think it was 2 weeks ago that the MP for Rhondda Cynon Taf made an appeal to the community to stop engaging in listening and following to conspiracy theories, because apparently this was leading people to abandon the government advice. There's a whole fascinating psychology there in terms of conspiracy theory. It seems that it's a way of trying to maintain some measure of control over a situation that you don't understand or can't control. So it's easier to believe the conspiracy theory than live with the ambiguities of the reality. It's having serious problems there. It affects our behavior. We long for the physical touch of other people. That's something maybe you've not really felt before, but it's there now. There are problems with eating and drinking, and quite often people become very withdrawn. But I want to stress it's not all bad news. I love this photograph. McDonald's have only opened drive-throughs, and here are 4 very resourceful gentlemen who it appears don't actually own a car. So they've made one out of cardboard. I think this photograph was taken in Germany. Whether or not those chaps were let in, I don't know, but they should have let them in. I think that's really quite inventive. But it's a reminder, isn't it, that people are adaptable. We're far more adaptable, actually, than we realize. And actually, by definition, we're actually very resilient. There's an interesting phrase, you've probably heard of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, often associated with military people and people working in emergency services, but quite frankly, it can affect anyone in many contexts in life. But what isn't so well known is the increasingly well-researched area of post-traumatic growth, that we can go through some really quite damaging experiences and come out the other side better as a result of it. It's not all bad news. And people are reporting, for example, discovering new values, a new appreciation of the family, more time with the children. Some are reporting simple things like a sudden interest in gardening or baking or something like that, which they found really enhancing to their well-being. And some have even gone so far as to say that this period has given them more time for self-reflection and working out where are the real values. Do I really want to go back to that job, which seems to be just crushing the life out of me and the busyness associated with it? Now, I better say a word about coping strategies, and these are general ones. By coping strategy, we mean ways in which we might respond to maintain our well-being and develop our resilience in something like a global pandemic. Now, the first one I've put down there is be in control. Now, quite frankly, you can't really control what's happening. You can't control the virus. You can't control the way the government is allowing us to do certain things and not certain things. But there are things you can control. And I think actually it's really important. And one of the biggest things you can do, which probably will have a positive effect on you, is to try to control you yourself, your exposure to media and social media. If you turn on the news at any point now in the last 12 weeks, it has been constantly coronavirus. It has been the regular ticking away of the numbers of people infected, the numbers of people who have died, the sense of despair. It's really not good for you. And so if you are a bit of a news freak, maybe limit yourself to listening to the news once a day, or choosing one particular media outlet which is you feel is reliable. And again, exercising some control. Don't let it control you. Be realistic about what's happening. It really is quite grim. Being in a global pandemic is really a very frightening thing. And so be realistic about how you're responding. It is okay not to be okay. And perhaps it's a really important thing that in church generally we should be trying to create a culture where we can say to one another, do you know, I've had a really bad week. I've had a lot of doubts, a lot of fears, whatever they may be. Be honest, be realistic. But at the same time, be wary of saying, and we say this so often to ourselves, well, I should be okay. I should be stronger. I need to be coping with this. Well, okay, maybe in some circumstances it's fair to say this, but quite frankly, you've never lived through a global pandemic before. So that takes me to perhaps the most important thing I would want to say. Be kind to yourself. And it really is okay to do this. It's not self-indulgence. It's not abandoning your responsibilities. It's about balancing all the things that are going on with your own need to resource yourself and care for yourself. Now, I wouldn't begin to say how to be kind to yourself because everyone has their own ways. You might say, I love spending an hour doing a bit of gardening. Frankly, I couldn't think of much more that would drive me up the wall. But some of the things I might do to relax might fill you with fear. So we've all got our own way, but find your way, find your happy place. Be kind to yourself, invest in yourself, talk positively to yourself. And of course, be connected with friends, talking, and most importantly, listening to one another. Boundaries are so important. When I made the transition from being a physiotherapist into the ministry, it was a real shock, though I'd been brought up in a pastor's house and thought I understood the ministry lifestyle. But I went from a world of 9 to 5 with occasional on-call at the weekend or in the evenings or through the night. But it was all very clearly boundaried into a lifestyle that started from when I woke up to when I went to bed. And many people are experiencing a similar thing during lockdown. Suddenly work is in your home, but your family is in your home, and your leisure is in your home. And often these things blur into one. So it's important of drawing up boundaries. Again, this is about being in control, or at least having some measure of control. So try to work out the boundaries between work time, family time, time for yourself. And you as a whole person need time. Your body needs time. So don't neglect things like exercise. Even if you're not a great exercise freak, going for a walk an hour a day, the magic number when you've got your heart and lungs up is about 45 minutes. If you're not really breathing heavily on a good walk, at least an hour and a half is even better if you can find the time. But doing something physical is really important. And with your mind, take every single day what the Americans love to call a mental vacation. Whether it's a novel, it's an episode of a serial on Netflix or whatever it is, or I don't know, whatever it is, find something of no consequence whatsoever and just read it or watch it or whatever. And it's important not to neglect your soul. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. The last thing I'd say about coping is it's so important to be grounded, to know certain things that are absolutely true and unchangeable at a time like this. And again, we're going to start to move to look at these two things, soul and being grounded. But I want to do it actually from a Christian point of view, because I think there's an awful lot that Christianity has to say to us about good mental health. I love this quote. It's from no lightweight. Professor Andrew Sims is a former president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And he wrote a very interesting book called Is Faith Delusional? Why Religion is Good for Your Health. And in that book, he writes, the advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality on the mental and physical health is one of the best kept secrets in psychiatry and medicine generally. That's a very bold statement, isn't it? And I wonder why that is. And it seems to come back to the really powerful worldview that Christianity gives you. And I think this is hugely helpful at a time of global pandemic. And in many ways, it fits with what a lot of psychologists speak about, the need to be grounded. Let's pick that up for a minute. Being grounded. It's about finding your points of reference in the storm. You're walking down the street, there's a sudden massive gust of wind, you brace yourself. Well, we need to brace ourselves mentally and emotionally at days like this. So there are two things you really need to know. One is that you're loved. The other is that you're safe. There's loads we could add to the list, but I think these two will be right up there. That's a picture of my wife and my son. They love me. And sometimes I really have to remind myself of that. Not that I doubt them, but it reassures me in the midst of what can be sometimes a brutal world. Staying safe, well, we're in Wales. We needed a picture of a castle somewhere along the line, even though I have my suspicion that could be a French castle. So we better move on. You see, worldview. Christians know why the world is in a mess. The Christian view is that the world as we know it today is not the way God originally made it. In fact, it's become terribly corrupted. Something very powerful and really, really brutally nasty has brought total chaos into the original world that God made. I'm married to Karen. She's a biologist, and she tells me that this wonderful quote from Sir Peter Medawar, who was a British biologist. I was asking her earlier on about viruses. A virus is a piece of bad news wrapped in a protein coat. You know, viruses, I think, are a really good example of what's gone wrong with the world. Of course, the Bible calls it sin. But what a virus does is it comes to a healthy cell and it attaches itself to it. And effectively, like the pirates of old, it boards the new cell and heads straight for the nucleus, the kind of nerve center of that cell. And basically, it changes the nucleus of that cell so that that cell itself starts pumping out more virus particles, and they in turn carry on the work. So the virus invades, takes over, corrupts, and turns a healthy cell into a virus-making factory. And that's a powerful image of what sin has done in our world. It's invaded, it's come into the very heart of each one of us, corrupted us from the way in which God originally made us, and turned us into destructive people as well as creative people. Now, the other thing Christians know, though, is that God is in control. And this is hugely important. We may understand why the world is as it is. We know that we live in a world of uncertainty where viruses are capable of being produced, but we know that there's another layer of authority. Our world is not ultimately at the mercy of COVID-19. God is in control. I love this verse from Isaiah. It's a book in the Old Testament. It's a great chapter, that 40th chapter, as it just speaks about how big God is. And it says there, the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They're regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Whatever is happening, Christians always know God is in control. But it might mean that if you think that somehow God doesn't care. He's just in control. Which brings me pretty much to the last thing I want to say. You see, Christians know that God, as well as being in control, has done something. And it's really quite remarkable. He has loved us in our mess. He hasn't waited for us to clean ourselves up, stop our racism, stop our injustice. But he's actually loved us where we are. And the evidence for that is that he sent Jesus, who incidentally was the sanest person who ever lived, who entered at the same time fully into our humanity. So he knows what it is, for example, to be tired, weary. He knows anxiety. He even knew what it was to experience despair and loneliness. So he really understands you, and he really understands me. And that's a wonderful thing. But he was sent not just to be with us and understand us, he was sent to rescue us from the mess. And he does that by dying in our place and being raised from the dead, showing us that the ultimate power of this dreadful mess, the ultimate power of sin, has actually been gloriously broken and obliterated by Jesus, by his resurrection. And in that resurrection, he offers you and me the welcome to come home and be eternally safe. I want to finish with this. In all the chaos of today, there is nowhere to know where you are more loved or more safe than in Jesus Christ. I genuinely think the Christian worldview has so much to say in these anxiety-provoking days. Now, I'm aware that I've gone through this very, very quickly, and there may well be things you want to pick up on. Please do so. And if you are struggling at this time, you really do have my complete empathy, really. It's a terrible thing. These days can be very, very difficult. And so we do hope that some of you will find some of this at least a little helpful. There we are. Well, I'll take that off the screen now. John, there we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks. That's a really good note to end on as well, isn't it? A note of hope, and that being grounded in a reality that goes far, far beyond ourselves, even far beyond the boundaries of this world is comfort, isn't it? Even in really difficult times. So if you're watching, I've got 3 questions I can see have come up so far, and people have been voting on those. We won't crack on with those just yet, just to give you time if you need to take a break, go and grab a cup of coffee or something like that, and come back, maybe think about how to put your question down into words, or go and browse those questions, see if somebody else has asked the question you wanted to ask, but you weren't really sure how to put it. Go and have a look at those questions, vote for the ones that you like, and write some more. It'd be great to have a few more. But Phil, I've got one question for you before we turn to those listeners' questions. You talked a bit about your background to begin with. You kind of talked us through lots of really helpful stuff about mental health kind of in general, and how the good news of Jesus and what he's done in the world connects deeply and connects today with that. But what about you yourself? You kind of hinted at a few things, but how have you personally been finding life in lockdown and kind of putting these things you've been teaching us into practice?
Yeah, I've got to put my money where my mouth is now, haven't I? Yeah, I've had moments where I really have struggled. Yeah, I think I'll give you an example. Funny enough, I bumped in today to my GP, who also happens to come to our church. And I was telling her I was doing this, and I had a little chat with her about something that happened to me recently. And she said, "Why didn't you tell them that tonight?" So here we go. I suppose more recently, I found myself working a lot harder. I attended an online conference, which was great. It was exhilarating, but I realized one day I'd actually been sat in front of my PC with no break, really, other than to nip out to the loo for about 8 hours. And that went on for 4 days. And I don't think I'd fully realized the effect that was having on me, plus preaching twice on a Sunday and midweek and doing some pastoral stuff in between. And I think I just got quite run down, quite tired. So I had this weird thing happen to me where I woke up one morning with a sense that something really dreadful was going to happen on July the 7th. Don't worry, it was yesterday. And it really gripped me. And it was an irrational thought, an irrational fear. And the fear was, it morphed, it developed into something where I actually believed that a family member who's very close to me was going to die on July the 7th. Now I thought to myself, how do I work this out? Well, I kind of pressed on, it disappeared. And then it must have been about last Thursday when this thought came back with a terrific vengeance. And by the way, last Thursday, I was absolutely exhausted. I was really tired, quite burnt out. And I had to process that thought and work it through. And so I did that as a Christian by saying, well, in the end, God's in control of everything. And if that is going to happen, it's going to happen because he's in control. And more than in control, he is a heavenly Father who loves me very much and has promised me grace to get through this. At the same time, I turned it over to him and said, look, Lord, I think I'm having these thoughts because I've been overdoing it. And I realize that this is one of the ways the brain and the mind and thoughts can malfunction when we're really overdoing it. And in doing that, I I struggled a lot still. To be honest, if I'm really honest with you, I woke up lots of times in the early hours of Saturday morning in a state of panic, thinking about this, had to reprocess it, had to pray about it. And then wonderfully, when Sunday came, I had a terrific sense of peace. And I'm delighted to say that nobody close to me has died on June the 7th. So it was an irrational thought, purely related to the overload that I had rather foolishly allowed myself to experience.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for sharing that. I've got one question that comes from that. That's a really encouraging story of kind of speaking truth to yourself, of having other people come alongside and help you realize reality. Working it through in prayer, in applying the gospel and Christian truth to what you were feeling. What about mental health issues where that kind of thing, where just kind of more prayer or thinking about the gospel, having a Christian friend have a chat with you, where that kind of thing doesn't seem to be enough or doesn't work? And I mean, you are in an interesting position of being a Christian pastor who kind of spends your week teaching people about Jesus, but also you have that kind of medical, psychiatric, physiotherapy background. So how do you know, this is my question, how do you know when the struggles that you're having mentally, or perhaps the struggles a friend or a loved one's having, have tipped over into they really need to see somebody who's a professional and can deal with them from a medical perspective, and where it's gone beyond kind of a Christian friend getting alongside and saying it's going to be okay and praying together and saying, let's go and get some extra help? How do you work out when that moment comes?
This is such an important question, and thank you for asking it, John. I'd say, first of all, that I'm not one of those Christians who thinks that the answer to emotional and thought disturbance is simply read your Bible and pray more. And sadly, I have to say that sometimes that has been the response of some Christian leaders, that you are this way because there's a deficiency in you spiritually, or you just need to get a firmer grip on the Bible or something like that. I think sometimes that can be wholly damaging. I think that it doesn't take seriously the reality of God's common grace in providing us understanding and, in, if you like, in the area of how the mind works and how emotions work, which is an ever developing area in terms of human understanding. But making the distinction between, is this a spiritual issue, or is this something that maybe needs some support and some intervention in the area of psychological medicine or something like that? I've always used a bit of a rule of thumb, and it's flexible, but it's there, which is that I found that if it's a spiritual problem and I talk to someone and say, look, the Lord understands, for example, or there's always hope here. There's a great deal of hope here. And you offer, as it were, start to nudge them in the direction of the Bible and prayer and fellowship. If it's a genuine spiritual problem, invariably people will try and grab it with both hands. It's like chucking a life belt out to someone who's drowning. Immediately there seems to be some measure of resonance that, yes, there's something here. This is the answer. And I think in the end, the Holy Spirit will draw someone in that direction. If it's really a more medical problem, or more to do with just the mechanism of the mind and the emotions and understanding perception and memories and thinking of the future and things like that, I think in all honesty, that sort of offer of help often makes very little difference. Or the reaction you may get is a rather, yes, I know those things are important, but. So that's where I tend to see the difference. And certainly as a pastor, I never, ever want to overestimate my abilities. And I'm very keen to send people sometimes to say, look, why don't you at least have a chat with your GP? You may find that helpful. But at the same time, I'd never abandon someone to that process. I'll walk with them through it.
Mm. Thanks, that's really helpful. The top question is kind of related to that. So it goes like this: in the context of a diagnosed mental illness, so when somebody has, I suppose, at least begun to go through medical route, how would you respond to a well-meaning Christian who says all you need to do is to pray more?
Yeah, my response is always the same. And I love, kind of quite like to get hold of these people sometimes and say, listen, would you ever say that to someone with pancreatic cancer?
Mm.
Would you say that to somebody with type 2 diabetes? Or to somebody who's a paraplegic? If it's a properly well-established mental illness, I think effectively when you say that to someone like that, you're treating them in the same way you would treat somebody who has an established physical illness. So sometimes I'll use that quite deliberately to try and almost shock someone and say, look, I know you meant well, but would you say that too? And invariably that brings a measure of context and perspective. You see, one of the problems is we have such a poor understanding of mental illness. And sometimes we tend to think that as Christians, we have the monopoly on anything to do with thoughts and emotions, because the Bible is a book that presents us with massive thoughts and speaks often about the heart, the soul, and emotions. So we tend to think that really as Christians, it's only to the Bible we should go for that.
Mm.
But there's an awful lot that the Bible doesn't address about our thoughts and emotions. And there is wisdom in the world. And the reason it's in the world is because of God's common grace. For example, if we do eventually get a vaccine to COVID-19, that will be a result of God's common grace. The fact that we understand the way insulin works with type 1 diabetes, that's God's common grace. And we should not be afraid about seeing common grace in the area of the way in which perhaps medicine has looked at things like the workings of the mind and emotions. But sadly, there are Christians who respond simplistically. I think they mean well. I like to think they mean well. But sadly, sometimes they can be quite destructive.
Yeah.
Is that all right, John? Do you think
that's really helpful? On the same theme of helping others who are struggling in this way, so the next question is this: how can those who haven't suffered with depression or anxiety, who can't really relate, or maybe they have, but they're just at least not knowingly, how could they relate and encourage? How can they have? You were talking about empathy earlier on. What is it that somebody who hasn't suffered in this way can offer to somebody who's going through that at the moment?
This is a great question. This is, I guess, coming from someone who wants to help, but often feels, can I really help if I've never experienced what you experienced? But there are so many things that people experience that we have never experienced. So, for example, if somebody has breast cancer, and thankfully you haven't, you still will find a way to reach out to them. We don't have to have somebody's experience before we can actually help them. Two things. The first, I'd say, really quick things. Learn the difference between sympathy and empathy. And rather than me mess it up trying to tell you the difference, go on YouTube or Google Brene Brown, sympathy, empathy. There's a fantastic little video.
How do you spell that?
Oh gosh, now you've got me. I've got mild dyslexia, so a name like this is just a nightmare. But yeah, it's a lady, Brene Brown. I reckon if you kind of mess up the first word, Brown, you'll probably get right. I know that one's Brown. I'm sure you'll find it. But if you put something that remotely looks like Brene, I think it's BERRNE or something like that, Brown, sympathy, empathy, you'll get this little video clip. In a way, I should have had it ready to show you because it's short, it's a little cartoon, and it basically shows somebody who's fallen down a hole, and one person comes along, they stick their head over the top saying, oh, you're in a hole. Never mind. That's kind of sympathy. And then it shows someone else coming along and actually sitting next to the person in the hole and identifying them. Empathy is essentially the desire to move towards acknowledging, recognizing someone else's distress. Is very important, is very powerful. Yeah. And it leads me to the second thing, which is try to learn some listening skills. Actually learning to listen to someone is a skill, and listening in such a way that you kind of draw out good things in them. You give them permission. See, we don't understand this, but something really powerful happens when you have internal distress and somehow you manage to find some words that come some way of describing just how distressed you are inside, and you speak out the truth of what's going on inside to another human being who really is with you and wanting to understand you and care for you, something powerful happens. In fact, something life-changing can happen. It can happen in one conversation sometimes. So it's so important as Christians that we learn to be good listeners. The first thing you must ever do is somebody who says, look, I'm really struggling with my mental health, or I'm just feeling so down, is to try and find a way of entering into their world and giving them permission to talk to you and just listen. When people come to me with big problems, well, probably pastorally, the biggest problem that's ever come my way, I spent over a year listening to someone before I really began to speak into their situation. So learn the difference between sympathy and empathy. That's a really good starting point. And look up things like listening skills. My guess is there's probably a lot of good videos on that. I actually went on a listening skills course once, and that was really helpful to me. There's simple skills you can learn and practice them on your friends.
That's good. Somebody's helpfully posted the link to that video. So we'll put that in the notes below the YouTube video. So if you're watching this on recording, I'm sure that'll appear if you.
Thank you for whoever did that.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, related question. What about, I suppose, particularly at this time, when we're apart from each other, can't really see each other easily physically, how would you spot somebody suffering from mental health when we're in lockdown and have limited personal interaction?
I think if we look at it, if I would kind of restrict this to like a church community, is that all right if I do that?
Yeah.
I suppose it would work elsewhere. I think often the clearest way is in this situation, I think people just become increasingly withdrawn. And it's very easy in church life for withdrawn people to be overlooked. And so I think that's why it's great that a lot of churches have now quite recognized systems of pastoral care in place, making sure that people are phoned at least once a week or something like that, so that they're not overlooked. But withdrawal tends to be, I think, or the other thing is looking for real erratic changes in someone's, just the way they are in their behavior. Maybe, for example, they might start sending you loads of emails when, or loads of texts when normally they wouldn't send you one. Well, of course, it flips the other way, withdrawal. You suddenly don't get anything from somebody who might have been texting you every day. So it's looking for uncharacteristic changes. And then I think it's also about listening to one another. And we can pick up cues. It's a little bit more complicated, this, but I think there are things that you can detect in people, particularly if you know them well. You just think, that's a bit odd. Why do they put it that way? Why do they keep saying this? If there are things that are out of order, out of characteristic, don't be afraid to give them space to explore that with you. So saying things to them simply like, that's really interesting. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Well, you've mentioned that a few times now. Is this troubling you? So I think those would be some of the ways, but it is hard because we're not physically present, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe just to say, if you're not part of Ammanford Evangelical Church, you're just listening on your own, you're not really part of a wider community where people might notice if you're struggling, or you might be able to notice others. We'd love to have you kind of get to know us and us get to know you a little bit more and offer some help. So this is by no means kind of an exclusive thing for Ammanford Church folks. So if that's you and you're struggling and feeling a bit isolated and cut off, we'd love to do whatever we can do to get in contact and draw you into a wider circle. So feel free to get in touch. We'd love to spend some time getting to know you.
Can I throw something in there, John? Actually, it might be good for you to think of. I've been thinking about it here, and maybe other churches will. The American comedian Ruby Wax, she had her own problems, mental health problems. She's been very open about those, and her way of coping was to go to Oxford University and do a degree. And as a result of that, she's written several books. And one of them is called Frazzled. It's an interesting book. I read the book. I went to see her at the Swansea Grand. She had an evening talk about this. Interestingly, on that evening, I sat behind Benaz Akbar, the lady who does the weather on BBC. Anyway, we're off subject. The reason I'm raising this is that she set up a thing called Frazzle Cafes. And they were done in conjunction with Marks and Spencer's. The idea was it was a place where you could go, be anonymous, talk about the worries and stresses of life, because their argument is there's very little community and people need community. Now it's online, it's really blossoming. And I've often thought perhaps churches should offer something like that.
Yeah.
A kind of, frazzle. I don't know, is there a Welsh word for frazzled or something like that? We could replace it with, but something that says, here's a Zoom meeting where you can come and just talk about stuff.
Yeah.
Where do people go to do that?
Yeah.
In isolation. Sorry, John.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Maybe someone will be inspired listening to this and set one of those up. Talking on kind of what can churches do, interesting question here. How do churches find the balance between being there for people and not trying to replace medical health professionals? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but the question goes on, might it ever be appropriate to have a mental health ministry? So where does church and kind of medicine, church and NHS fit together in this?
This again is a great question. It's really important. Church is about soul care. The old Puritans used to talk about the pastor or the minister being a physician of souls. And that should be our main concern. But within that, there's a huge, if you look historically, a lot of people, for example, by the way, think that psychology only started really at pretty much around about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It didn't. You can go all the way back to people like Augustine back in the 4th century and see that there was really good psychology being done by Christians. And this is one of my big bugbears, that we tend to think psychology or psychological medicine is a new thing. No, it's been done by Christians for a very long time. There's a few things here. Firstly, the church needs to rediscover this. The church needs to rediscover a measure of confidence to help particularly struggling Christians with these areas in life. But at the same time, the church clearly can't do everything. And there are acute phases that people may go through. And so how should the church respond to that and find that balance? We're not very good at that here in the UK. A lot of US churches will have a very neat procedure in their church. They'll have a counseling team. They'll have points of access. They'll have a way of actually effectively assessing someone and then signposting them if necessary for further help. And I think this is an area that church leadership needs to look at and say, what do we do? Do we have not necessarily a policy, but do we have an understanding of how we manage this kind of thing? And when people are moved, say, in the direction initially of a GP, a local mental health team, or a crisis team or something like that, all I would say is it's really important the church doesn't say, as I heard someone say in a sermon a few months ago, and it's one of those rare times I wanted to rip my computer screen off and throw it across the room. Don't ever say to someone, well, you just go over there and get yourself well, and then come back and we can continue to teach the Bible to you. That's a massive dereliction of duty. That is not what it means to be an under-shepherd. If people find themselves going from perhaps initially raising a concern in church to being supported by church and then into the area of the mental health support services that are in our country, continue to walk with them. Never just abandon them. It's the worst thing you can do. And people who are really acutely ill mentally may sometimes have some extraordinarily challenging behavior. They may say things which are extremely distressing to you as a Christian. It's so important that the right people are engaged with that process that can handle that, and yet at the same time be there for people and love people.
Yeah, that's
really kind of forgot the question halfway through that. So did that?
Yeah, well, check.
Was it semi on target?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was really helpful. How can we make spaces? You mentioned you're kind of interested in men's mental health and suicide earlier on. So the question asks, how can we make space in our churches for men in particular to feel comfortable when vulnerable? Comfortable being vulnerable and open about their mental health. So anything we can do, kind of talking about processes or...
I think,
things we can
quite
use?
frankly, in terms of process, it's very difficult. One size doesn't fit all. You'll have a certain community of men, say in your church, which might be different to ours and other places. The only thing I can say is I think when you do get men together on their own, and you do it perhaps on a regular basis, and it's not just come together, we're going to study the book of Nehemiah together. But, last Monday, we did an online curry night with the men in the church. And it was great. It was hilarious, to be honest. I haven't laughed as much for so long because half the people turned up, hadn't got a curry, they'd got something else. And there was a lot of banter and that. But I noticed as the evening were going on, little bits were leaking out about how people really were. And so I'm really keen to just try and keep that going. It's getting men together in an environment where they feel comfortable. And the biggest thing, they need to feel safe. Nobody's going to talk to you about real life issues if they don't feel safe. And that's why when people speak one-to-one, things like confidentiality are crucial.
Yeah.
Now, in church, I always view confidentiality as kind of corporate confidentiality. And that's probably from my experience working, in the NHS, where you'd have a ward meeting and you'd be sat in a circle, all the multidisciplinary team, hearing someone's life story being shared by someone. But that's a concerned team with an ethical kind of context. In church, we never promise absolute confidentiality, because if someone says something to you that's a danger to them or to someone else, you've a duty, I think, then to operate. And it may be necessary sometimes within a leadership to say, within the bond of confidentiality together, we need to talk about this. But if there isn't clear confidentiality, people don't feel safe. I think it's one of the reasons gossip is absolutely slammed in the New Testament. I mean, it's right up there with murder, because we can't really care for one another if there isn't trust. So coming back to the original question, which is a great question and I haven't really answered, I think the best I can say is try to develop ways of bringing guys together. And the more you do it, you begin to love one another more and walk together more. And hopefully along the way, with much prayer, people feel safe to say. I mean, let's face it, one of the biggest things men are struggling with is online pornography. But it's very difficult for a man to say, I've got a problem with this. And we need to create environments where people can do that and not feel they're going to be stoned, rejected, marginalized, or given some trite answer. Because particularly in that area, someone rang me just this last week about that in another church. And you have to say, look, this is probably going to be a very long process, but there is hope. And I honestly think this is an area where putting together a support team around someone in the life of the church is actually really powerfully helpful. But generally, we're a long way off this.
That's really helpful, Phil. So we've talked about kind of in tackling mental health struggles, we've talked about the importance of truth and kind of knowing the true Christian story and how that helps ground you. We talked about Christian community in church. We talked about the place of kind of medical expertise. Somebody's asking, should Christians see Christian counselors? So that's a kind of another category of folks, sometimes within the church, sometimes maybe from another church, sometimes a professional counselor. What's your take on seeing a Christian counselor?
A few years ago, I'd have said definitely, but now I'd say not necessarily. There are some really, really good secular, folks who are not Christians yet, as I like to think of them, counselors who can be very, very skillful at helping you understand why you think the way you think, why you feel the way you feel. And sometimes they can be, just as helpful, if not more helpful, than a Christian. At the same time, there are some really great Christian counselors as well, though in the UK, so I'm going to get a little controversial now. In the UK, the whole understanding of Christian counseling seems to have fallen into just one available area, which is the biblical counseling movement. Now, I have great friends who are really signed up to this and a part of it. I myself aren't. I would tend to fall more into the well, let's take some good stuff from that, but also let's take some good stuff from just common grace, basic understanding of what's going on in the world today according to proper, reasonable science. And also, let's not forget to look at how Christians have done this in the past. So if you look for a Christian counselor today, invariably you'll be looking to find somebody who's signed up with biblical counseling. But personally, I think, broaden it out. If the only help that's offered to you is a secular counselor, don't kick it into touch. All right, there are some very good secular counselors, and they are bound by an ethical code of working, which means they can't say to you all your problems are because you believe in God. Those days have long gone, by the way.
Thanks.
Psychiatrists used to do that. You know that?
Yeah.
These delusional ideas about God. They don't do that anymore because they've discovered the Christian worldview is actually a very powerful therapeutic tool. And so they try to utilize it. So a good secular counselor will say to a Christian, well, what does your faith say? What are there aspects of your faith that can be a help to you at this time? What about prayer? Things like that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. That's helpful. So counselors, yes, a good idea.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think we all need counseling, actually.
Yeah.
If you're in the ministry, you certainly should get it regularly.
Cool. Mental note. Is anxiety, so a question about anxiety, which is a kind of thorny one I try to think through a few times, but is anxiety really a signal alerting us to pray, or is it a recognized mental illness?
Well, it can be both.
About anxiety briefly.
Yeah, it can be both. I mean, the Lord, the Holy Spirit, God works on us by his Spirit, often in our conscience. The word of God works on our conscience. That may create real anxiety. If you look at conviction of sin, which is interesting, isn't it? That somebody hears that we live in a fallen world. Oh, that's fine, makes coronavirus and stuff like that. I can agree with that. But then they begin to realize that they themselves are part of this and they're sinful. And that can elicit, in some cases, a real strong sense of anxiety. How do I get right with God? It was only a few weeks ago, it was the day of Pentecost. Peter is preaching in Jerusalem just after Christ has gone back into heaven. And he basically preaches to a big crowd. And he's saying, I'm massively paraphrasing now, but he basically is saying, look, you lot, you crucified the Messiah. You thought he was non-kosher, but in reality, he was the Messiah. And look what you've done, you killed him. And at this point, we're told they were cut to the heart. And they interrupted Peter and said, what must we do to be saved? They're a high state of anxiety. Now, something like that, you have to say, is appropriate. That's an appropriate anxiety. And certainly God may use anxiety and worry to draw us to himself, or allow us rather to experience anxiety. But anxiety can so easily cross the line into something that really has very little to do with our relationship with God, and is more to do with our relationship to our environment, what's going on in the world, or our relationship with ourselves, our past, our view of the future. And we can find in real extreme anxiety some very, very distressing physical symptoms taking place. And I almost think, John, you're back to this thing then, that if somebody's in that state, the offering of help and hope in Christ does nothing to it. It's like the proverbial hard-boiled peas, dried peas bouncing off the Sherman tank. So real anxiety can be absolutely crippling. Yeah.
So you see the place of kind of medical expertise and the church encouraging folks to make the use of all of God's gifts.
You've got to keep your head screwed on. I mean, if you're very anxious, go and see the GP and they just sign you up for some tablets to make you feel vague. Frankly, I don't think that's a very good way of dealing with anxiety. I think finding a way of talking and trying to understand why you're anxious and then trying to find some ways of responding to that is massively more helpful. And that kind of takes us back, John. I actually think churches can do more in this area.
Yeah, it'd be great to talk more about that. So I've got one last question.
Great.
We talked a lot about lockdown, and this is one about as we're coming out of lockdown, how do we deal with anxieties and worries about coming out of lockdown? Things like not being sure how to integrate back into a job, being around people. How might you, are you really helpfully address kind of fears and worries now? But what about as we get back to whatever the new normal is going to be?
Yeah. Well, it's going to come, isn't it? It's going to come for all of us. There's going to be that moment when they say, yeah, sure, you can go and watch the Scarlets, but you really want to? Or you can send your children back to school now, it's fine. You can come back to the office, everything's okay. It's going to create, isn't it, in you, in me, fears and anxieties. How do we deal with that? I think firstly, it's recognizing that that's quite normal, that that's really understandable. I think if you're in a context with work, I think it's important to say that, to let people know that you're fearful, that you're anxious. Don't be afraid to do that. Well, I realize that sometimes in some work situations that's very, very difficult to do. But it's about recognizing it and letting people around you know that I'm not altogether comfortable with this. I'm finding this difficult. I'm willing to move in this direction, but it might take me a little bit longer than it takes the next bloke or the other woman to do. So, yeah. I think another thing, John, is that some of us have got very active imaginations. And if we're not careful, we can play out so many scenarios. And when I was working in a health service and doing stress management, one of the things we used to use with people was a simple phrase, which was, where's the fire? And it was all back to the old fight and flight mechanism, which I now know has been massively upgraded since then. But the idea is that if you're in a burning building, you're going to be pretty stressed, and a lot of the physiological responses to stress are totally appropriate, and it'll be really brilliant for getting you out of that building.
Yeah.
But if you're just thinking about going back to work, your body doesn't really care whether you're in a burning building or just dealing with the apprehension, anxiety of going back, going into work. It'll respond the same way. So it's important to recognize that as well. And then you're into the area of being kind to yourself, finding ways that work for you to kind of unwind. But asking the question, where's the fire, is helpful, because what it does is say, do I really have the right to be as worried as I am about this right now? When I was a little kid, can I tell this story? It'll be really quick. When I was a little kid growing up, I had a record of nursery rhymes. There was a brilliant nursery rhyme on there. Not a nursery rhyme, nursery stories, moral stories. And there was a story of a hotel in Switzerland where there was a huge, heavy cast iron pot on top of a shelf in the kitchen. And one day, someone in the kitchen said, oh, wouldn't it be terrible if one day that pot fell off the shelf and crushed the manager's little daughter? And immediately he said that to someone else in the kitchen. They said, oh, this would be terrible. And then they said it to someone else, oh, this would be terrible. And then the porter comes in, oh, how dreadful. In the end, there's a whole load of it. Oh, it's terrible, it's terrible. And then the little girl comes in and she says, why are you all upset? And rather embarrassed, they tell her. And she says, but the pot is on the shelf. And suddenly it was a moral tale that often the things we worry most about are the things we imagine. So ask yourself, where's the fire? If the building's on fire, panic. Right. It's perfectly appropriate. It may well save your life.
Yeah.
There we are.
Yeah. Thanks. That's really helpful.
There's another question come here from Sammy, by the way.
Okay. CBT. So yeah.
Okay.
About CBT for anxiety and depression.
Yep.
This, looks like an important question.
CBT, right? If you don't know, cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's the go-to thing in the NHS at the moment, partly because it's been well researched in terms of does it work, so it keeps nice, happy, and invariably people are offered 6 sessions of this. And I know people who have been greatly helped by having CBT. It's really about, and this is terribly simplistic, but CBT is really trying to work out why we think the way we think, and why our behaviors are linked to the way we think. I've just made a right mess of trying to describe it. You'll have to Google it. But I'd say about CBT, there's 2 common objections to be aware of. One is that it's quite stoical. So I need to change this way of thinking for this way of thinking. And I think that's brilliant. I think that can massively help a lot of people. But some people say it can be a little bit stoical. And for example, I have a very good friend who's actually written a book on a kind of Christian version of CBT, where she introduces the heart into the equation. And I think that's quite interesting. Mm. The other thing to say about CBT has actually gone out of my head. Oh, yes, I remember now, is that personally, actually, I prefer to get a little bit further back rather than just looking at environment and how it triggers thoughts in certain ways and how we may replace those. Personally, I like to look at further back as to why people think the way they do. But I also noticed that Sammy's put a note on here that there is someone in the church who's a CBT practitioner. And
yeah, that's Charlotte Davis. If you know Sammy, our senior pastor,
yeah,
Charlotte, his wife, is
oh wow,
well trained in that.
So she might be punching holes in the wall right now as she's heard me say what I've said.
Well, if that's your question, and you know Charlotte, or yeah, you can get in touch with her. If not, then you can. I guess it's worth saying this as we wrap it up. You can get in contact on the comments below this video. It should be up for a while yet, and we'll keep an eye on those. So get in contact through that, or the church website, ammanfordchurch.org. You can head there, and we have a contact form. Come and say hello. Sammy says she's more than happy with everything you've said.
I'm relieved, and I do underline there's an awful lot of good that comes out of CBT, and people have been really greatly helped by it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds from what you're saying, what you've said this evening, there's so many different helpful things that the Lord has given to us to tackle this. You know, community, truth, medicine, psychiatry, psychology, all sorts of different good gifts that God has given to us to answer a big array of problems in complicated people that we're body, mind, and soul, and take a lot of unpicking and unwinding. So, like you said, being kind to ourselves, remembering God is a good and generous God who stepped into our mess to suffer with us and for us. It's a great place to start. So thank you very much, Phil. We've run out of questions.
Great.
I'm sure there are many more, or maybe folks would like to get in touch. So like I said, YouTube comments, we have a Facebook page, church website. You can come and catch Sunday services back on YouTube, back on Facebook, and various other avenues, I think, on our website as well. Come and get to know us. If you don't know us at all, come and introduce yourself. If you're a church member, don't be shy as well to put into practice what Phil's been talking about, and be a part of the community that you'd like to see Ammanford Evangelical Church grow into, a community where we can share together, where we notice and listen well to each other, where we ask good questions, give each other time, even when we're far away and isolated and don't see each other physically. Let's make the most of what Phil's said to us this evening. I guess maybe most of all, let's talk. That's something we can do, isn't it? Whether we're feeling great and on top of the world and loving lockdown and don't have any problems with mental health at all, there'll be plenty of people around us, loved ones and neighbours, who are struggling. So let's talk to them and ask them, really ask them how they're doing, and see how we can grow in listening and helping those around us. Let's talk to the Lord about it as well and pray for people. And if you are struggling, well, I hope this has been an encouragement and a help to start dealing with that, or to carry on and think of other ways of dealing with that. And so to bring it to the Lord and talk to him about it, bring him into your situation, and then to go and talk to us, to me, or to Sammy, or to anybody else you know in church, to talk to. We have several people who are really well qualified, like we mentioned Charlotte, a good number of others as well, who'd love to help out, who are happy to give their time chatting to you, encouraging, giving you resources, pointing you in the right direction of people to go and talk to. So don't be shy, don't be silent. Make sure that you're talking to the Lord about it and bringing it to him, and talking to people and making use of all the good gifts that he's given. So thank you, Phil. It's been really, really helpful, a real encouragement and a great starting point for this as we head on into the future, discussing and dealing with this as a church.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's great what you're doing. Terrific. Well done.
Thanks, Phil. Well, that's all from us this evening. We'll be in touch soon. Well, Sunday services, if you're a church member or you just fancy kind of getting involved in church life more generally, we have a Zoom session Wednesday evenings. Get in touch and we'd love to hook you up with that and kind of meet some church people face to face through a screen and chat and pray and catch up. So Wednesdays, Sundays, and come get involved, come and be known, and hopefully before too long we'll be actually face to face again and able to see each other in the flesh. But thank you, Phil. Thank you for listening, and we'll be in touch soon about more things like this. Thank you.